naturally
just
keep
don't
your
talk.
voice a little
Just-
bit low.
I
No,
just
no,
don't talk
just keep the
at all.
voice a little bit lower.
Yeah, just a little bit.
Don't get excited.
Over enunciate.
Yeah, Brant can always pump it up.
Don't sound like you're a local sports radio guy
Exactly. Okay.
or a local news anchor. All right. Well,
We already talked about the weather.
yeah, we occasionally get a show on the road. This time, I think we've got a circus train. Welcome to season 16, episode 9 of Sci-Fi Wargaming. This might actually get you 2 episodes in one with the number of people we have here. We've got both halves of Dr. Wits, both Aaron and Austin are here. Aaron, welcome back.
Thank you very much.
And Austin is here also, so welcome back.
Thank you. Good to be here.
These are the guys that also joined me for the AC/DC Happy Hour kickoff show when we announced the pre-orders were open for their Littoral Commander Space Force game. And so that's the newest, as far as I know, that's the newest thing you guys got out there. But they were also the design team behind Robotech Reconstruction and have a variety of other irons in the fire. I'm sure we'll end up mentioning at least some of them at some point tonight. We also have designer Keith Tracton is back with us. Keith, welcome back.
Thank you very much. Always appreciate being here.
Glad you're here. And then because we needed somebody smarter than the rest of us to be here as well, our buddy Rocky is back as well. So thanks, Rocky. Appreciate you being here.
Thank you.
So this crew was assembled to talk sci-fi wargaming because it is something that all of them do and enjoy and appreciate and design in the case of 60% of the panel tonight. So there were a couple of things that I kind of had in mind that I wanted to ask about. We talked about them a little bit as we were, as Austin was on the run from the law, trying to find a safe place to record that I wanted to throw out there and to preface this a little bit for the audience. So sci-fi wargaming, there are certain hallmarks of sci-fi that I'm sure we'll talk about here in a few minutes, but there are certain key things that you expect to see in sci-fi war games, right? We're looking for, lasers and spaceships and, whatever else. We know what all the tropes are. Probably some aliens running around in there, but not necessarily. It just depends on the effects budget that you've got to spend. But at a certain point, there are things that you just got to have in a sci-fi game or it just doesn't feel like a sci-fi game. And so, Keith, we'll start with you because you've got a couple of them out there right now. We just finished, as we are recording this, Hethwill's last part of his Stellar Rats AAR.
For Raider Drop Zone.
From Raider Drop Zone. I knew the name of the game. I was trying to remember the name of the series of articles. It's the Stellar Rats.
Stellar Rats Recon. That's the first scenario.
That just finished running. So as you're sitting down to work on your sci-fi game, your sci-fi universe, what are some of those standard tropes, hallmarks, things that, man, if they're not there, this just ain't sci-fi?
Well, I guess there's tropes within the tropes. So Raider Drop Zone, it's a bug hunt, and there's a wonderful history of bug hunt games. And this was, how do I just needed to have a bug hunt based off of, the concept and an homage to Starship Troopers, but on a different scale. And scale becomes the way the games are, scale is the game's concept. Ground scale, time scale, unit scale. So for Raider Drop Zone, for example, I've got the aliens in that one. The Kraken are definitely aliens. And, how do you make it feel like you have an alien? And what you're talking about is what tropes are you there? It's like if the alien units and the Terran units are using the same combat system and it's a more conventional wargame resolution, how do you make it feel like there's aliens out there instead of, Terrans and powered armor? Real quick, one of the things that I did was, the Kraken are similar to the Arachnids in terms of mentality. It's like they're underground. They have a brain that controls them. But basically, when they go into combat, their units do not have the option not to attack. So when you commit them, they're going to attack. Now, the Terrans have the flexibility to say, we're getting the crap beat out of us. We're going to stop now. And that little one thing seems to be on the scale we had, which is a company scale, the mental difference that for players feels like these are aliens, because when you're playing the Kraken, you're like, I got 5 units that can attack it. And you get to the third one, you're like, well, I'm getting the crap kicked out of me. I really don't want to attack with the other two. It's like, no, you got to go.
Yeah.
So it's little design concepts that actuate that we want aliens in this particular case. On a larger scale, it gets tougher. So I mean, Aaron and Austin, I mean, you guys have a larger scale when it came to Robotech, and that's I'm covering that in a different game of mine. But how do you address that? Because now you've got formations that are these Robotech formations with the different mechs and everything, and then you've got the infantry and coordinating. It's like an ogre problem. I've got really big units that are in the same size counter as really small units or 500 infantrymen. What do you kind of do for that?
So, I mean, I don't think the scale thing is, how to put this, scale has never been the thing that has ever troubled us, because we've been so focused more on the outcomes and actions. And since we've always been linked to outcomes and actions, the scale problem just doesn't come to mind. We think of, well, here's what these things could do, irregardless of scale. Mm-hmm. So since things were already achieving outcomes, we didn't have to really prioritize that. We had to prioritize scale more a little bit working with Control Commander Space Force, because we're much more concerned about how these units traditionally balance each other. But even then, we still think of the units as, what does this unit type achieve as an outcome? I mean, one of the things I took to heart listening to someone like Sebastian Bay is just how powerful a small company level unit can really be with today's technology, that it sort of frees us from scale. We're not designing, in our case, Napoleonic Wars, where we have to worry about those sort of lines of masses. And so we've luckily been able to dodge that problem. We might be able to dodge it forever, but at least in the short term, we've been able to dodge that problem.
And for people who don't know, in Robotech Reconstruction, the scale is basically most of North America. So like the area that the conflict scales over, the area the conflict is in is pretty huge. However, because we're working off of the show, because we're trying to do a direct translation, most of the actual battles were pretty small scale items. So even then, you're basically having small scale tactical fights kind of just set in this larger, in this larger environment.
Yeah, well, and the other thing, working with Robotech in that particular case, you had a pretty well-defined IP, so you sort of knew what the tropes were that had to be there. It's not like you're having to, it's not like you're doing what Keith was doing, which is literally world building from scratch. You guys were doing the opposite of building from scratch. So that did help some, I would suspect, in terms of putting some guardrails. Sounds like you were trying to go outside of them, but put some boundaries on there for you that you had to operate within.
Right. And we also consider Reconstruction to be it is also more of a political game, how the different factions interact with each other. So in that sense, sometimes there are some factions who don't want any conflict at all.
Rocky, what about you? When you're sitting down and grabbing a new sci-fi game off the shelf, I know you're big on a couple of the actually zipping around space sorts of games, and that adventure war game middle ground that you like to talk about. What are some of the hallmarks of sci-fi that you're looking for as you sit down and start thumbing through the new game that you just bought?
Well, I think my sci-fi war game has gone through a couple of phases. I mean, at first, you took like Panzer Blitz and you just put battles in it. Just put battles. You renamed your tank hover tank.
Right.
So
Hammer
you just sort of
Slammers.
re-skimmed it. Hammers Slammers. Mayfair. You're reading my.
Yep.
You're right after my heart. But then there was the whole very technical side of like the sci-fi spacecraft games. I mean, Starfleet Battles, Accountants in Space, which has its element. I mean, it's all about power. Give me more power, Scotty. Give me more power. Where's the pieces there? And then you find ways to streamline it. I mean, some of the early space games, somebody reminded me about Alpha Omega. Alpha Omega was like one of the original,
God.
Maybe one of the original 4X games that was out there. It's a lot of the space 4X games. Explore, expand, exploit, explode, whatever they are.
Exterminate.
Exterminate. But those came there too. So but these days when I pick up a sci-fi game, I guess what I'm looking at is not necessarily the mechanics of the game, but sort of the feel of what it's going to be there. And I think something like what I heard there about like Littoral Commander Space Force is great, because you're not stuck with this very linear, hey, I have a 3-2 infantry versus a 4-5 armor unit. What is it really going to do? How do I show that technology piece in there in a way that's enjoyable and gameable? And at the end of the day, sometimes the sci-fi games are more enjoyable in some ways than the historical ones because you're free from a lot of those biases out there. Oh, am I playing the bad guys? No, I'm going to stomping some bugs. And who doesn't like stomping bugs?
Yeah, it's interesting. By the way, guys, I love the whole concept of literal commander space because I watched the presentation. And I think what science fiction brings to that kind of thing is it's literal commander. So people are like, oh, great, I'm going to have like carriers and stuff like that. It's like, wait, what if it's in space? And now the whole drop zone thing comes into play because I love that. I love the way you have the map set up where it gets smaller and smaller and smaller until you pick where you're actually landing. And there's a whole game within that game. And I think that's what science fiction brings to games in general is you can take a real world thing. Well, whatever you are dropping to a planet. And now you've got like, well, how does that actually happen? Little on my games, like Raider Drop Zone has an orbital artillery rule. And what it is that when you completely clear this 75 mile by 75 mile company drop zone with your Starship Troopers, if the Kraken have space superiority over you, now you're a clear target. So you win, but you take orbital artillery. And that was sort of something we arrived in playtesting. Like, wait, I've got the fleet up here and you've just cleared me off. Why wouldn't I call in final protective fire? And like, well, you would. So it became a rule because it happened a lot. So having something where you're like, where you get to think outside the box and go, would that actually happen? Or how does that happen? And then it gets realized and then you get to play with it. And now it's like Rocky says, it's like you've got this, you don't have to think about, oh, I have a 3-2. It's like, I have the capabilities of this thing. Where am I going to put it? And how's it coming down to the planet? And you just get to think about that kind of stuff in other games.
Well, so I think it sounds like one of the things that becomes an expectation a little bit in those sci-fi games is that we're not just fighting terrestrially, right? There's an expectation that there is off-planet something, whether it's orbital artillery or interplanetary and interstellar travel. At some point, we are leaving terra firma and not just to fly an airplane around. Like we're actually escaping the atmosphere and doing something out there somewhere. So that's kind of what it sounds like a little bit there.
I don't know, because like I would think of a war game somehow based on like H.G. Wells' Time Machine to fit in the science fiction world. And I don't really think of that as a game that would leave Earth, but what you're doing is because you're bringing in this new technology, you're changing how Earth behaves. So many ways, there's something transformative that takes place, either because of being off the planet, because of technology, or even the lack of technology that changes. But it creates this weird problem. You don't know when you're doing science fiction anymore and when you've become pure fantasy. And that's a hard thing I have trouble when I think of a science fiction war game is, when is it still science fiction? And when does it become a fantasy novel?
Right, science fiction fantasy, exactly.
Yeah.
Well, I think it's one of those things. Look, we've talked about this a bunch, and Rocky's about to roll his eyes. But the whole, what is a war game conversation? That the center mass of the target, I think we're all pretty good with. It's the further towards the edges of the target where things get a little fuzzier. And that's not true. That's not only true just in trying to define war games. I used to run into that when I was teaching college, and we would sit around and have the conversation of how do you define media, right? What is the media? Like we all can easily understand that newspapers, books, television, like that's the media. Greeting cards. Are greeting cards part of the media? What about, your local punk rock fanzine that somebody's spitting out, 20, 50 copies of at the local copy shop? Is the form factor is very similar to your local independent weekly newspaper, but is it big enough that it becomes media? Like once you get away from that center mass of the target, the resolution gets fuzzier the further out from the middle of the dartboard you get. And I think you're going to run into that same thing with, where science fiction starts to blur. We're all pretty comfortable with that center mass of the target, but how far out do you have to go before it starts to get a little too fuzzy for you? And I'm not necessarily after trying to fully define, what has to be there for science fiction, but just as we're talking about what sort of separates sci-fi gaming from other kinds of gaming, particularly in the war game space, what are some of those things that we expect to see in the sci-fi realm that we're not necessarily seeing in more traditional wargaming? We're getting to the point now where contemporary wargaming, lasers are a normal function that you're starting to expect to see in your weaponry available to you. For a long time, man, if a laser showed up, that was a sci-fi game. Now that's barely near future. I mean, we're busy shooting down, balloons over El Paso Airport with lasers.
Lasers and missiles and drones. Oh my.
Yeah. So again, center mass the target, got it. Things start to get a little fuzzier the further out we get, but there are certain expectations in there. And Rocky, how far off base am I here?
Well, I don't think you're far off base. I think what it's come down to these days is, whereas maybe the early days of sci-fi wargaming, they wanted to define a war game by the tech that was in it. I mean, it's almost like, just look at any way War Games Awards goes. Like, it's all by era. So World War I games, World War II, American Civil War. But I think as we've advanced in where we are today, a good sci-fi war game is almost the best way to show the asymmetry. And I liked what Dr. Wirtz, Aaron was saying, is that, okay, War of the Worlds, that's asymmetric. I mean, you got these giant tripods, and then you can go and you can do those fantastical weapons. The ram ship that was in the classic battle. Sci-fi allows you to take these asymmetric, wild, wacky, interesting matchups and put them out there. You label it a laser if you want. You label it a plasma gun. You label it a doohickey boobob from Planet Z. As long as you're showing the asymmetric effect and then the interaction of those effects, that's really what sci-fi wargaming unlocks for you. You free yourself from the bounds of, I have a 88 on a tiger. And I can go build that giant ogre out there and go and roll around and see what I can do against all these small little hover tanks and the like.
Yeah.
Or to build on that, Rocky, you take those standard weapon systems, you put them in the place you never thought they'd ever be in, right? We now have an M777 on the moon. What is about to happen here? Is it going to work? How far is it going to fire?
How far is it going to recoil?
Yeah.
It's like, welcome to no gravity.
Yeah, you're going to shoot around, 68 miles down range, and you're going to back your cannon up by like 14 miles in the other direction.
Just to paraphrase, friendly recoil isn't.
Yeah, man, you got to really dig that sucker in if you don't want to go too far.
I mean, and to Aaron's point here, like with creating Littoral Commander Sci-Fi, one of the things that we've been trying to do is keep it as hard sci-fi as possible.
Oh, yeah.
So even though we're trying to go into the future and we're like, okay, so we have different weapon systems, we have to, we have laser systems, but then we have to think we've been thinking really hard about, like, okay, so what does that mean on Earth? What does that mean on Mars? What does that mean on the moon? And we have to still make it plausible and realistic and show to the players, as the players play through these different scenarios in these different environments, they get to have a sense of like, oh, this really is different.
Totally appropriate. I mean, think on a smaller, simpler level, but not on a more realistic level, because you like what you said about taking existing weapons and putting them in unusual circumstances. The other way is, let's say you have a ship to ship game, say your structure of like the old not Mayday, Snapshot, man to man in the spacecraft. Are you going to take the armor penetrating rocket launcher, or are you going to take the flechettes that won't penetrate, the hull so you don't get blown out? Knowing which weapon to take in which environment is really an element. For me, it's an element of science fiction that, whether it be a fictional weapon like a flechette machine pistol, or whether it be a real weapon like M777, it's like, it's interesting. It draws you in.
Yeah, absolutely.
One of my favorite things about Space Force is that, so inside the game system, there's this concept of munitions, right? You keep track of your different munitions. There's some munitions that are specifically for ground combat. And in the normal games, you can only use these systems if you are in the same hex as your opponent, because you're fighting ground combat. Well, once you get to the moon, once you get to Ceres, suddenly you have the option of using your ground munitions to fire into other hexes.
What'd you do? I just took the machine gun and just did an S, and they're just flying over the horizon.
Right. The shots are going so far that you can do that. Now, of course, accuracy drops down, lethality drops down, but you can still do it. It becomes options.
Yeah, plunging fire at that point has a serious effect. So we talked a few minutes ago. We were making, Rocky, you made the reference to, you can kind of reskin Panzerblitz and off you go. And Keith made the mention of, that was Hammer Slammers. And we were actually talking about it at BGF briefly. There is a particular designer and publisher who I'm not going to name that have actually looked into the Slammers IP. Now, I don't know how much that may be complicated with David Drake having passed away. God, it's been like 2.5 years now, which just seems crazy.
It does.
But I don't know how that's going to, interact with the Drake estate at this point and how they manage the IP. I will say, and I think Rocky has said as much elsewhere also, if you really want to play Hammer Slammers, just get out the Striker rules, because you can do like 95% of what was in the Slammers books with the Striker rules. But part of what the Hammer Slammers board game, the Mayfair board game from the 80s, suffered from is that at a certain point you have aggregated things high enough that you lose visibility of what the cool sci-fi stuff is. And at a certain point you're pushing around counters that might have a hover tank graphic on them but are not behaving significantly different than a tank platoon from Panzerblitz or Panzerleader or Arab Israeli Wars, like any of that series. Or something very similar to the Assault series. It wouldn't take much to reskin the Assault series as Hammer Slammers and still have essentially the same thing you had back in the 80s. I'm using that as an overly simplified example because it's a game that's been around for a while and an IP that a lot of war gamers do know. Because military sci-fi is next to military history, military sci-fi is fairly common, I think, amongst war gamers as something that we read. And that's a well-known series. But at a certain point, the aggregations just don't matter, I don't think. And there was a BGG thread, and I think we've discussed this on another podcast at some point, but I'll link the thread to this episode. Somebody was asking, why hasn't anybody taken something like OCS and done like a cool sci-fi story, sci-fi game using something like the OCS system? And my initial thought is because you couldn't tell. Like at a certain point, you've aggregated all of your laser tanks into a battalion of laser tanks, and it's just a tank battalion on the map. Like how can you tell the difference? What is it that you need to stand out as being a sci-fi game instead of just a sci-fi themed version of OCS? You guys did that with some of the differences in the Littoral Commander system relative to the I don't want to say normal ones, right? But the more deliberately immediate near future ones with things like the way you've modeled the orbital drop with those mechanics. That was kind of cool. There are things that you've done to help stand out a little bit. But those things, most of those counters are operating at the individual ship or ground platoon level. Whereas when you start aggregating those things up into, battalions and squadrons, Rocky, how do we distinguish between, a German tank battalion on the East Front and some laser tank battalion, out on Alpha Centauri somewhere, if we're aggregating up at the battalion level? How do we draw those distinctions?
I think you don't.
All right,
and
cool.
I say that sort of tongue in cheek, but if you look at sci-fi war games, when it comes to like ships battles are basically a big part of the ecosystem, because you can have individual ships and you can have those ships do fantastical things. You can do everything from your Star Wars yank and bank pew 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 to something like a Starfleet Battles, which was a whole energy management system, power your weapons, power your shields, and everything in between. You can scale that up from individual ships to squadrons of ships to fleets pretty easily. When it comes to ground combat, I think the majority of the games that we end up seeing out there are at those smaller scale, smaller units, because that's where this tech, the sci-fi feel is still distinguishable. Star Grunt, Dirt Side, those are miniature systems out there, very simple, very direct, but they don't go higher than maybe your units representing 3 tanks.
Yeah.
because as you start getting higher, at the extreme level, go back, look what Frank Chadwick did in Invasion Earth. It's a traveler game series. The only thing that distinguishes you there is different tech levels, which all comes down to like die roll modifiers, and a tech level 1410 power unit is the same as like a tech level 1200 power unit because of the different tech scales. But okay, I see it. I understand what he's saying, and this one 500 man tech level 15 unit can clean up an entire World War One army. Got it. But what's the thrill in that?
Yeah.
And it's all just a die roll modifier or just a conversion on a table, and there's nothing really exciting about that. And I think there's reasons why those games like that were there and they just never really were picked up. I would not want to play an OCS sci-fi one, because I just can't see it doesn't give me that feel that I can when I'm at the smaller level and I have a small unit, I have a skirmish scale game, and I have a laser over here versus a minigun over there, and I can see how that's operating when I have somebody with the bounce, jetpack troopers to hop over the terrain, things like that. It just for ground combat, smaller scale is what works. The larger stuff, no.
Yeah.
So,
I was just going to say real quick that there are, Hammer Slammers, those things were aggregated just at the platoon level. They weren't even up past company levels. I mean, we're talking, 4 to 5 tanks, and you could still barely tell the difference. But I would contrast Hammer Slammers with another contemporary game, which was the Grav Armor game from Heritage. That one was tank platoons and infantry platoons out there, but still had a more distinct sci-fi feel, in part because the art was better. Let's just face it, the art does make a difference with providing that setting. But going back to some of the asymmetric capabilities you guys talked about earlier, those existed more in Grav Armor, but they also, Grav Armor had EW ratings, which was one of the very early war games to do that were giving you a capability that didn't exist in very common usage in many other war games of any kind at the time. And so there was an EW capability that would interfere with command and control. EW being electronic warfare for folks that aren't fully up on acronymies. So there were some of those other capabilities that you saw in Grav Armor. I'd hate to say that they were modeled in Grav, because they're not really modeled after anything, but they were modeled in the game, that you saw something different like that. It was either Aaron or Austin was about to jump in.
Well, I was going to say, I think what both your points are making very clear is that for a science fiction war game to really seem worth going through the pains of being in a science fiction universe, that game needs to either liberate yourself from a conventional warfare constraint, or it has to liberate yourself from the history. And I'm referring to an old piece Rocky wrote. One of the things he emphasized when he did his review of Robotech Reconstruction was how he appreciated that since you weren't tied to a human history, unlike other coin games, it allowed you to really think of the strategies in a way that you would not have, because you didn't feel tied to a particular moral outcome. So it gives you options, in essence, to liberate yourself from previous constraints that hold back what you can do if you are sticking to a real life, contemporary, or past situation that gives those games the ability to explore things that otherwise you can't do.
There's a bit of buy-in. I mean, it's because a sci-fi game is fiction, and so I think the border is you're not going to do an OCS. Most OCSs are historical. How do you adapt that to something that's fiction? You have to do a really fine analysis of what is the difference between my laser tank and my Sherman Firefly from World War II, and you have to scale the game system to display that effect. So I've been working on, and Brant knows this, I've been working on a science fiction siege, which we just upscaled because it wasn't epic enough, called Hammer Bastion. When I read a book out of the 40K universe, oh my God, 40K. But I did a prototype of a war game on that siege from the book, because it's from that book. And I made, I made about 600 counters, laid out, blew up the thing to 2 full maps, and just did like an assault on the southern wall, and it's Gaunt's Ghosts, and I'd read all those novels from 40K, and I'm like, this is it. And I think it's part of it is, if you have the buy-in of the world, then the mechanics become overlaid with, this is the same stuff we'd use for, say, OCS, but because it's, Gaunt's Ghosts and their scout platoon firing down the road there, it's a whole different thing. And it's a platoon versus, say, something larger in OCS. What's the difference between drop troops that have full flexibility that paratroops don't have and paratroops? Can you have them both in the same game? That's tough. I always bear in mind Starship Troopers, the original. So 2 pictures of scale. One was actually on the back of the box of the game, but it was in the book, which is, you're dropping down a powered armored trooper, a cap trooper, and he has the power of a platoon. One guy has the power of 54 in the game. And then in the book, one of the best quotes ever is he's like, one warrior in 50 is one arachnid warrior in 50. Excuse me, one bug in 50 is a warrior. He makes up for the other 49.
Yeah.
And that's this kind of the scale of power. So much power in all the artillery and tanks and laser tanks and everything in this 40K thing that the author wrote in a shield, like a Star Wars shield, a dome over a city that functions like now you've got, who's in charge of the shield? How is the shield powered? Can you knock off a portion of the shield? Who can shut the shield down? Is the goal to shut the shield down? What happens when this artillery shield goes down and now all the artillery is exposed? And you can hear just in those, we're exploring a whole different world, and that makes the science fiction work. But I mean, Rocky's point of, it's OCS. If it's just OCS, if it's just the military part of it, you're right. It's like anything else. I think if somehow you get, I want to say IP, but if you get the buy-in to a science fiction story that you like, I think that helps to distinguish that. But it takes a really hard analysis of, well, what is the power of your laser? Because it's fictional, so you have to make it up. You have to scale it. And so the design problem becomes almost harder because it's like, well, is it stronger? Is it weaker? So in Hammer Bastion, I have tank for the guys who have so many more tanks, a lot of them, and they have armor. They don't have the best guns. The other guys have a few, but they've got not only good armor, but also better guns, which they need. So balancing it out that way is like one technique. It's a lot. It's a lot. But I think the goal of having an OCS style game, I think it's worth taking a crack at. That the 40K that I use as a prototype for my own IP, that was the closest I got. And I still once in a while go back and take a few shots because it's fun. It's because OCS has that solidity of system that if you did one, the question is because every OCS game has its own game rules. What would the game rules be versus the series rules? And that's really hard to do on that scale, but I think it's doable.
Still stay in the point about talking about scale, because the history of warfare is hitting things at further and further distances away. When we first started working on Littoral Commander, one of my fears is that even just going hard sci-fi, looking out as far as we're looking, that suddenly everything can shoot everything on everywhere on the map, and it's like, well, that's not really fun then. But thankfully, as we actually did work on the calculations and actually put things together, that ended up not being the case. And at the other end, the idea that there's some simplifying that goes on was actually a benefit for us as well, because we're also trying to build up this this kind of future world from scratch as well. And the fact that we didn't have to get into the details that much, like Aaron was doing calculations of okay, if I throw a single grenade on Cirrus, what is that going to do? How far is the shrapnel blast? And I'm also thinking okay, but we're also at we're at a company or platoon level here. A single grenade doesn't necessarily matter for us, or at least we don't have to get into that much of a detail, even though it matters.
Yeah. Depends on where it lands. So I want to grab.
It depends on how far you can throw it too.
Well, that too, yeah. I want to throw it farther away from me than the blast radius, right? As long as I get it that far away, I'm happy.
Season 16 of Mentioned in Dispatches is underway, and we couldn't do it without our Patreon supporters, and especially the regimental captains at the top level. The Armchair Dragoons would like to thank Chris Anthony, James M., Brian Silcott, Chet Bell, Joseph Knorr, Paul LaFontaine, Miles R., Staggerwing, Fred Stogg, and Fred 2, Kevin Bertram, Michael Sunborg, Patrick Garrity, Catastrophe Games, Hethwell Wargames, and Greg from Pico Armor. They help us to keep our objectives in our line of sight. You too can support the Regiment of Strategy Gaming as a Patreon supporter at patreon.com/Armchair Dragoons.
Sticking with the narrative piece of this, look, ultimately we're telling stories with these things all across the board, but the idea of the buy-in to the narrative. So Aaron and Austin, you guys sort of had that already literally out of the box with the Robotech game, because you were going to get a bunch of people that were buying it because of the Robotech-ness of it all. Keith, you were talking about, you started noodling around with this idea for this 40K thing, and then, how much of that was a direct line into your own Hammer Bastion game versus how much of it was just an idea that you were then able to evolve into Hammer Bastion. You were still, in your mind, you started out with sort of this defined story that you then built into your own narrative game world. And so the stories that we tell kind of matter there. And so I'm going to go away from the both of y'all and throw this to Rocky first. But, Rocky, the stories that we're telling here, how much of this for the narrative buy-in for the player is dependent on buying into the story, such that having familiarity with an IP ahead of time might help with the buy-in in the story versus, sort of having to build that buy-in by building that narrative for the audience to sort of, enmesh themselves in that world and buy into the narrative that way. Not sure there's a question there, but take it and run with it.
So as an old guy, I am more, the game has to draw me in by, the first thing I'm going to look at is the box cover. And the second thing I may look at is the box cover. If I could say I'm going to
Does that include the back of the box? It includes the back of the box, right?
Yeah. I'm going to look at that because that's what's going to draw me in. I think a problem that we face in the game industry today when it comes to things like these sci-fi war games is there is a group of consumers out there who look IP first. And they will just go, hey, if it's got this, this name on it, if it be it from this IP or from this author, I'm just jumping in. Nothing else matters. I go back to the original one. I need to find a sci-fi story, a game that tells me a story that I am interested in. I'm not necessarily concerned, is it a Star Wars or is it a Star Trek or is it a Robotech? Is it something else? I'm going to look at the box. I'm going to say, is there something here? Which means that the game has to sell itself on why it is the science fiction. Some people hate it. I happen to love Marine 2200, Marine 2000? Carrie Anderson's game. I love that one because it was just so, the game itself is just an infantry battle, but the difference in that one is it actually sort of presages where we are with Ukraine is you got to be able to see, and so you elevate. But when you elevate, you're more vulnerable. But that whole game is a whole. It's a hunt and shoot. You're hunting the other guy. Your weapons are once you get in range, they're very effective. But you want to hit them further away. So what do? You got to elevate. And you're on the moon, so you can go higher. Gravity isn't the same thing. You can jump up there, jet up there, whatever. And then if you can see it, then you can go after it. That's an interesting little sub game. I like that. That's the science fiction I like. Nothing to do with an IP. All to do with about how are we taking these weapon systems or these weapons concepts and how are we putting it into a game mechanically and playing it in a way that challenges me to come up with a creative solution.
Yeah. So Carrie Anderson did I think it is Marine 2000, but he also did the Moonbase Claudius game that you had covered as well that doesn't quite have the same mechanics. I think it was the Marine one that you were after there. I think if it's the one I think it is, I think we also had an unboxing of that many, many moons ago. We were still doing unboxings from our buddy Tolstoy out West Coast that we got that from him also. I want to come back around to the idea of the box covers here in a few minutes, but I do want to throw it over to we'll go to Keith and then we'll let Austin and Aaron chime in. But the whole idea of sort of tying to an IP versus building an IP, like you kind of started down one road and ended up down another. So what do you think there, Keith?
Well, building an IP, It just takes so much time.
Oh yeah.
That's the literary part of it. And I distinguish between the literary part of literary IP you need to write a novel and the literary IP that you need to do a science fiction game. You need something that wraps the game action, but you don't need a novel. Eventually, if you do enough games, it's going to lead to a novel, but I'm not a novelist, for example. I always base the amount of IP I need to start with, again, Starship Troopers, a programmed instruction method on the rules, but each scenario had a blurb at the beginning that set the battle from either the book or a variation on something that happened in the book. So it was tied to that literary IP in that respect. And then I always remember Squad Leader, where it's like you had the blurb and then you had an aftermath. And the tying together the way you've actually said it and what actually happened is the choice of you as master of the IP to say, this is the way this scenario goes historically. And now you've started to do your novel. But the game scenario itself still is chaos theory. You never know exactly where it's going to start because nobody's going to start it the same way twice. And you never know where it's going to end. That's the game. So it doesn't detract from the game at all, but it does give people this sense that this thing works, that this scenario is going to have a result that's going to be somewhere, and then they're going to try for that historical result. And just, even whether it's built into the victory conditions or not, trying for that gives them a direction to go in the scenario. So it kind of helps. So IP can be more than just, where do you set this kind of a thing? I obviously starting from Warhammer 40K, it's humongous.
Yeah.
You could start, they built it and they will, because when you have a stable of, I don't know, what do they have, 20, 30 writers? And I stuck with Dan Abnett because he's my favorite.
Well, it also took them 45 years to get to this point.
Exactly, right. And my IP stuff actually started, a friend of mine started it in high school, and then he said, you do the Terrans. And so I did the Terrans, and that became my portion. He's passed away almost 20 years now. So I'm not using his portion, but he's kind of slayed out the map of where the combats are happening. I'm like, all right, well, it's in the Spiral Arms. It's pretty big. We'll take it from here. I invented new bad guys. And, the Krakens were one of them. And that's how the thing gets started. But I had that background that we've been toying with it since high school. Making it into something that's an actual published thing, whole lot harder, because you have to make specific choices about what is the story in this particular game. I literally had playtesters who would read, Raider Drop Zone, where there's very little of that, but there is a blurb that sets the scenario. And they're like, the scenario action doesn't reflect what you have in the blurb. That's important. Because when Rocky goes that one layer and actually opens the box and then starts to read the scenario book in lieu of the rules, it's got to match. It just has to. So it's a different form that it fits, but IP definitely informs on that. Again, my issue was starting with Warhammer 40K. I just wanted to do a fan game just to see if I was working on systems. The systems worked. They have since been further developed, but I'm like, I can drop this in because I already had a story about that kind of a thing. I just didn't have a system and a map, and so I went and did all that creative stuff. But I think IP, especially for science fiction, if you talk to people about, it's what Rocky just said. There's like, is it a Star Wars story? Is it a Star Trek story? Is it Hammer Slammers? Is it Armor, which tells a similar story to Hammer Slammers and not Hammer Slammers, Starship Troopers. For me, it's like the Forever War, Armor, and Starship Troopers are like a trilogy from 3 different authors about powered armor in its way. And even Forever War is not totally powered armor. Now you have a Dyson sphere, and you can't go fast. You have to use edged weapons. Again, a science fiction exploration based on the IP. When people go to space combat, now you've got the Honorverse, and it's funny when you mention like real world weapons. Every missile that get fired in the Honorverse that missed is still going.
Yeah, we were going to get to the actual like outer space combat stuff at some point here. So I want to give Austin and Aaron a chance to chime in here on the whole IP thing.
So the challenge with IP is your IP even known? One of the things we dealt with Robotech Reconstruction specifically is while there is people who like Robotech, a lot of people who we thought would be interested into the game, we assume have no idea about Robotech. And so for us, we had to teach the IP. Our game is designed to teach the IP so that anyone can play it. And that's the decision we had to make going into that design is what is the audience willing to do or not do with an IP. So even if you have an IP, it doesn't mean it's going to help you in that sense. It might give you a sense of how the world's supposed to work, but it doesn't automatically bring you an audience. Sometimes it does, but a lot of times it doesn't.
Yeah.
And then on the point of trying to build out the IP, for Littoral Commander, we're like because we're trying to be as hard sci-fi as possible. At first we were like, oh, this is going to be 20, 22nd century humans versus aliens. And then we're like, well, wait a minute. How far do we think in a hard sci-fi setting we're going to get in just like 100 or 200 years? It's like, okay. And then how advanced do the aliens have to be for them to get to us? And then we're like, okay, well, we just lose. Okay, that's not a game. So, okay, so now we're going to have this. So then we have to start building out. We're like, okay, so it's going to be human on human. So we're going to have Earth and we're going to have Mars. So now we're going to have a conflict between them. Now we have to like build out the entire conflict of why are they fighting? And so that makes your scenarios make sense. And because we're in all these different locations, you now have this like running storyline, a very loose running storyline that like goes between the whole thing. Right. The Expanse already did, but we don't have the IP of the Expanse. So we can't use any of that.
Oh, darn.
You could ask. I mean, but no, your point is taken. Like you've got to develop a reason why the fight is happening. So
well, and it's helpful too because it makes us think if we're going to make a scenario about something, why would you even do this action? I mean, this goes back to politics. Like we're very influenced by politics. You don't just fight for the sake of fight. You're fighting for some sort of political objective in the end. Why are we taking the time to invade Earth from Mars? Why are we fighting over the moon? Why are we fighting over Sirius? Why is this even something that we consider worth doing politically? Yeah. We're not going to rely on just someone randomly wanting to invade someplace for the sake of it. For the most part, wars take place with some idea of a strategic objective. So you're not just randomly doing something. There's too much resources at stake here. I mean, I'm an economist. I think war is an industrial process. There's so much resources at stake here. You're just not willy-nilly going to do something, especially if you're fighting in space.
Yeah.
Right, which gets me back to asking Keith. Keith, what is your drop zone? Why are they dropping on? Why are they doing the bug hunt? What do you got there?
And I built out a story that the Kraken are such a virulent species, and they don't care about things like humans care about things. They have dropped themselves. They've started to expand right on the supply lines of a major campaign, which is Hammer Bastion. So they basically have no choice but to commit the strategic reserve, the Raiders, who are the equivalent of Starship Troopers. It's the only ones left, but it's a core's worth. Drop them, and they found the home planet, and they need to exterminate them. Like bugs in that respect. And so now you have a literal bug hunt, and it's as simple as that. It's like where are they? What are they doing? And what trouble are they causing? And in this case, if you're sitting on the supply lines and preying on those supply ships, just because they can. I'm not sure. I didn't really go into depth about, well, do they use the supplies or do they just like trashing them? But because they work in so many different environments they can live in, they live underground, whatever it is, they work. Well, how is that even possible? They're just not as other starfaring race. They do have spaceships, and like they say in Starship Troopers, dumb races don't have spaceships.
Yeah. Were you guys getting the Stephen Hawking effect from Keith's audio there also?
Yes.
Oh, what was happening?
Slightly, but I'm hoping that's not too bad on his individual record.
Well, yeah, okay. I'm hoping we can clean it up with Keith's local recording.
Okay, I can always re-record for you.
I realize you do that for fun in your off time, but no, I don't want to have to go back and stitch it all together.
I understand. Well, I'm hoping that came through.
And the real question is, how much of these production conversations am I going to leave in versus edit out for the audience? We mentioned earlier, so Rocky made a comment about, the first thing I'm looking at is the box, and then I'm going to look at the box. And I do think the artwork probably plays a little more of a factor in the sci-fi world of wargaming than on the historical side for a couple reasons. One, there's probably a good half dozen to 2 dozen pretty common photographs that have shown up over and over and over on boxes out there. The British paratroopers walking down the street in the ruined street in Arnhem for market garden covers, the German guy throwing the potato masher grenade for like every East Front game ever,
starting with squad leader. Actually,
yeah, there's a about 4 or 5 stock photos of Rommel that show up in every North Africa game ever. So there's an expectation of, we kind of know what we're getting with the historical game, not just because the photographs almost become placeholders at that point, right? If I'm buying a Stalingrad game, I know what I'm getting with the Stalingrad game, regardless of what's on the cover. I got a pretty good sense of what's happening when I open that box. If I'm grabbing Gettysburg, if I'm grabbing Waterloo, right, as Cole Worley likes to call them, the Wargaming Stations of the Cross, right? I love that term. I keep using it. I will credit him with it forever. But he's right. We know what we're getting with those, but when I've got to sell somebody on a sci-fi something that they've never heard of, it may be an IP they've never heard of. Maybe it is an IP that they have heard of and they've got some familiarity with, in which case you're going to lean into the key identifying, characters of that IP, whether it's a Star Wars or a Star Trek or whatever. But for ones that I'm inventing whole cloth, Keith, you did this with your Raider Drop Zone, right? It's the headshot of the guy in the power armor. I mean, it's very clear that this is a sci-fi thing, but it's a fairly dramatic, this is the dude going into the fight, and it's up close but not personal because it's zoomed in on the body, but you can't see the face.
Right, it's got that helmet look to it.
Yeah, because the helmet there, that kind of the artwork matters probably more in a sci-fi case than a non-sci-fi case. And while we're applying this to wargaming, let's face it, this is equally accurate for RPGs, for other kinds of tabletop games, for whatever it is. The Arcs artwork for, Cole and Kyle's game, that the Arcs artwork had to, make you interested in, whoa, that looks like a cool sci-fi game. Even the sci-fi variants of Munchkin, while there is some sci-fi-ness to it, it is distinctly Munchkin artwork that you know exactly what you're getting if you open that box. So, Austin, Aaron, you guys kind of had, again, the Robotech thing to fall back on, the Littoral Commander Space Force when you probably had a little more latitude to work with. But how much of the artwork and what you wanted people to take away from that was something that you threw on the table as kind of an idea? How much of it came from the artist in kind of a collaborative way? How much of it might have been foisted upon you by the publisher and they said, you're going to do this? Like, what was that ratio and that mix there?
I think in both cases, it's very publisher driven. And that's in part because they're both very established brands for both publishers we've been working with. Okay. So we're not the first Robotech game. Plus, they're an RPG. And you've already mentioned RPGs are very art heavy. So there's already a very distinctive Robotech style book that's coming from them. I mean, the place where we probably had the most influence art-wise came more from the board setup to make the board setup work. That was clearly us where we didn't follow the traditional board. Same thing with Littoral Commander. And if you look at the Littoral Commander Space Force board, it's very clearly a Littoral Commander, and they add the space twist to it. So in that way, we've been very much linked to the past of what the publishers have done with these properties, which has constrained us. And not that it's a bad thing, because for us, it's important to signal that we're part of that history in our box art, so that people who come from those worlds are intrigued at what we're doing. So we haven't gotten to explore it in a way that I think other people have had the opportunity to when diving into a science fiction box art.
Rocky, what do you think? As you're shopping for, hey, what's cool in new sci-fi gaming? You mentioned the artwork. The Traveler Little Black Books, not famous for their artwork. Consistency in their look and feel, but as you're looking at other games out there, what about the artwork or where is it that it's pulling you in and getting that narrative grab?
I think we're going back to science fiction wargaming. So as you start to play a game, the first part of the fiction starts when you pick up the box. Mm-hmm. I mean, if I look at a box and I can't imagine what that game is going to be or could be from the beginning, then I'm probably not even going to take it off the shelf to or click online to click the cover to see further. If it doesn't start the story for me, then I'm never going to even open up to try to pursue it. So the fiction starts with the images. The fiction starts with that cover right there first to grab my attention, to start telling me a story. And then if that picture grabs me, I'll dig in and take a look and say, okay, what's the story here? I tend to be more of a sort of a systems sort of person, so I look for, hey, what are you doing here? Is it what game mechanisms are you using to try to tell me a story about something? Are you just reskinning the same thing all over again and just slapping on a replacing Sherman with Sherman and
yes, absolutely, yes.
So okay, then I'm not thrilled with that story. So, but if I can see something in there, like I talked about, it was Marine 2002. We got that clarified in the chat. Something in there that's going to tell me, hey, here's a little bit of something different about the battle, and the science fiction is helping us break the bounds of our biases, of, oh, you can't do that. Well, why not? Let's give it a shot and let's see what happens. That's what the science fiction story needs to tell me. It starts with the artwork. It starts with, I'll be honest, I mean, I like those little blurbs in front of the scenarios, like what Keith talked about and stuff, because it all helps me set the mood. You don't have the benefit of a historical game. You don't have the benefit of saying, okay, I know what happened at Waterloo, I'm going to try to change history. You're starting with nothing in a science fiction war game. So even those little blurbs, as small as they may be, are vital to helping you set the stage for what is going to happen, what questions, what challenges you're going to be facing.
As we're recording this, it may not be super common knowledge. It might have escaped contain, but maybe not necessarily with our audience. The Star Wars Shatterpoint game has been canceled recently by the company that was manufacturing it. It's not CMON, but I'm totally blanking on who it is. It is Legion, I think, is still on life support, might still be existing, but I'm not 100% sure. Armada's been canceled. The X-Wing dogfighting game got canceled. The series of collectible Star Wars minis games, yet another one has now gone belly up. And I think one of the challenges there might have been that it's a well-known, well-loved IP. But if you're trying to, grow your audience there, and you're trying to bring Star Wars fans into your game, which is one of the main reasons why you're going to latch on to such a well-known IP, is you think you've got a built-in audience there, is you want to play with the characters from the IP. And there's just only so many versions of a Luke Skywalker mini that you can sell over and over and over and over for each of those collectible expansions, for each of those new variations. At a certain point, not unlike the old Kenner action figures from the 70s and early 80s, at a certain point, there's only so many costumes you can put on Luke Skywalker before you've tapped out and you're sort of done selling variations of Luke Skywalker. And while Star Wars has a very deep well of characters that you can mine over and over and over, man, the people you're trying to bring into your game from outside of gaming, they want to play with Luke Skywalker and Darth Vader and Han Solo, and they want to play the hits, right? And there's only so many variations on the hits you can sell. And I think that's something that working with an IP, you might have to be careful with a little bit, in that, yeah, you can play the hits, but, Robotech Reconstruction was sort of a one shot, right? You got the game. Maybe you guys get around to expansion. I don't know. I'm not asking you to break news on here and, hey, we're working on this. We're just not supposed to tell anybody. Like, don't do that. But it's not a collectible game, right? It wasn't designed to have a constant flow of product that you continuously needed to feed. And for the collectible product games, whether it's collectible cards, collectible minis, whatever, that's a different beast to have to feed than simply building expansions or new scenarios or new modules, new adventures for, new scenarios for 40K, new modules or adventures for the Traveler or any of the other engine offshoots, because Rocky, I know you cover a bunch of those on your blog. Hey, here's this adventure, hey, here's this story that and again, you focus on the stories when you're writing about those. I think the form factor that the game takes relative to the IP also becomes a big piece of how do we continue to develop and build those narratives, and what can we still put in front of our audience over and over. I think that's a bit of a headache. Aaron, you ready to jump?
I was going to say, Strange Machine Games is very aware of the problem you're talking about. When we were pitching games to them, they're very clear. This time period is covered. That time period is covered. We can't just repeat time periods. We have to find ways that if we're going to do another Robotech game, it has to expand what we've already done because we can't repeat ourselves. No, for them, and Austin tells the story very well. When we pitched the game for doing this reconstruction period, they said we don't have a game for that reconstruction period, and it's been to our benefit in some ways. It's allowed our game within that Robotech audience to have a reason why they want to play us, because there are a lot of Robotech things out there. There's lots of RPGs, there's miniature games, there's various scenarios, and so as you said very well, people get tired of that. But what's left that's still interesting enough to still want to keep playing the series? And in some cases, I mean, my impression with some people, the reconstruction period was not always the most interesting period to them because it wasn't the bang bang period of the show. In some ways, our game succeeds because for some Robotech fans, we've turned a part of Robotech that they thought was maybe the boring part into an interesting part of the story.
Yeah. It's the time. I totally identify with the timeline thing. I mean, for my universe is called the Firepower Pass universe because that was the first game I tried to design. Have since pulled it down, but we'll be redesigning. That's the spaceship combat game. But it has a timeline, and that timeline is built into the scenarios. And I use that strategic map with the scenario locations in my ground games because I'm laying the groundwork for when Firepower Pass itself comes out. You'll see where those scenarios lay in. And then as I build past that to the strategic games, you'll see the same images reflected at a different scale, filling in those timeline gaps. I mean, that's the game, because if you've already made the choice of where the scenario starts and goes and where the game starts and goes, then you don't need to fill that in. That is the storyline. Again, it's not a novel where you need to go into, well, exactly how did this happen? That's the game. And that's, like I said, I'm not a novelist, so that's never going to happen on my end.
Don't sell yourself short, man.
Oh no, not a novelist.
Nobody's a novelist until they are.
I'm a ghostwriter.
So I am not a novelist. I have yet to complete a novel. I am a great novel starter. I'm not a novelist. One of my best friends is a novelist. Until he was about 47, he was not a novelist. So don't sell yourself short. We're a little over an hour here as we're recording. We are starting to wind down this episode. A bunch of this has been me sort of steering the ship a little bit into some questions that I kind of came in thinking, hey, these are a couple of places I would like to go as we wander through the wilderness of sci-fi here. Keith, is there a particular question that you were thinking you were wanting to ask amongst the group, or some idea you wanted to get out on the table that we hadn't got to yet?
It's actually more specific for Aaron and for Austin. Is because I know you're early on in development. Is that right?
For which game?
For Little Commander Space Force. I'm sorry.
So middle development. Pre-orders are up now. You can pre-order the game right now.
I think I did
already.
We are much further along. You can play it at Origins. Yes.
There you go.
And Fort CircleCon. Yes,
I guess that was kind of my question: is how long on the timeline was it? It was very narrow question.
We're at the stage where you're going through and writing out the scenarios and making sure the scenarios are written correctly. So gotcha. Double checking, making sure that we're using the right unit names, making sure we haven't made mistakes with how they work. Doing one last sort of run to make sure the scenarios aren't broken, and then also going through the many rewrites for rulebook.
I'm with you.
Never stop.
Please, never ends.
The whole thing about games aren't released; they just escape. Oh, Rocky, what haven't we got to yet that might be on your mind in the world of sci-fi wargaming that we need to circle back to in the time we've got left tonight?
Well, it became obvious to me that the Army guy wanted to dominate ground warfare in space, so we didn't get to talk about starships and what is the best sci-fi space game, and why is it always going to be Starfleet battles?
There is an entire YouTube channel dedicated to exactly these conversations, and it's run by our good buddy Chris Weave. That is the Starfleet Tactical channel.
Yep. Chris is great.
Chris has made a whole career out of, space. Well, not literally, because the guy does work in professional wargaming also, but he has made a long and storied side gig out of, space Navy, space combat sorts of things. And we've had some of those on previous shows. He was a member of the Bu-9 crew for a while that helped, advise David Weber on the Honorverse, as well as consulting on a lot of other books as well. So Rocky, I know we can't dig that deeply into Space Navy stuff, but what out there, what is there that we should be thinking about with some Space Navy pieces of this, and whether it's orbital combat or interstellar combat or interplanetary combat, and why is the Expanse still the best you're going to see on TV?
I think when it comes down to some of the comments we made earlier, or I made earlier, is space battle games are the ones that are easier to scale, so you can explore a wide, start from individual ships, go yourself all the way up to fleets, stars, get into the whole 4X sort of piece of the sci-fi wargaming. So space battles, starship battles is going to be your on ramp to a lot of those pieces. And what's the best one out there? I don't know. It's whatever you enjoy. I mean, Starfleet Battles was awesome. Federation Commander was a great reduction. Talon from GMT is like it's like a great refinement. And there's a lot of stories to be told there for designers. A lot of lessons learned for designers that can look at that whole evolution of games and see what sort of design lessons you can walk away with from that. But also just how you can enjoy something incredibly crunchy like a Starfleet Battles, or something a lot lighter and faster moving as some of the more recent stuff. So I mean, we didn't get the chance to dig into it here, but I mean, I think that's where a lot of where we really talk about space sci-fi wargaming, it's going to be when you're talking about the ships and fleets.
It sounds like we're already, lining up an episode for next season.
And as we should.
All right. I'll bring Chris back. I'll let you and Chris do it. I won't have to say anything.
If Chris is on, I need to be on. I need to say hi.
We'll just do it in 30 impulses.
Here we go. Impulse 29. I meet Chris.
Yeah. I do think there's a lot to, I mean, the fact that Chris is 200 episodes into Starfleet Tactical tells you there's a lot you can do with Space Navies. And I do think that they are a big part of the storytelling in that sci-fi world, because there's only so much fiction you can put in your science if you just sort of, roll the clocks forward 100 years on Earth. Like, once you get off planet and you get into the weird stuff elsewhere, the range of fiction in which you can place your science fiction gets a lot wider. So I do think you got it definitely right. So
yeah, and one of the reasons that Aaron and I weren't talking so much about space combat is that in order to do what we do in Littoral Commander Sci-Fi with that drop mechanic, is that we have to assume that a space battle has already taken place and has already cleared the way in order for the drop to happen. Because, I was telling somebody, I'm like, I think we've made, after playing the game, I'm like, I think we've made the drop too deadly. It's very deadly. And they go, well, if you consider actual reality, it's probably way more deadly than you've made it. You are definitely doing some sci-fi stuff there that makes it so it's not as lethal as it should be to get through the atmosphere.
Yeah. Then again, it's not like we've got a ton of real world cases to build off of. Yeah, I mean, we've gunned down some paratroopers over Arnhem here and there, but we haven't really tested, to my knowledge, we haven't actually tested anti-orbital dropship capabilities yet. So
obviously you haven't been to Area 51 lately.
Not lately. Not that I'm allowed to tell you about.
Right.
All right. So Aaron, we're gonna throw this to you kind of at the end of it all. What didn't we get to that we should have?
Well, we've got to it in about way, but we haven't said up front. And that is, why do you make a science fiction war game? Well, and I think I'm a designer, so I'm biased here. So I think about the making part, but it goes hand in hand with, why have a science fiction war game? What is the purpose of this genre to even exist? I mean, we could talk about just your favorite IPs, and there's some of that. But to me personally, I see it as a way of throwing out constraints, of being able to think of things that are not feasible unless I enter this world. I don't have to worry about, one of the great things about the Littoral Commander, I don't have to worry about if the U.S. Army thinks that my weapons are realistic. That's not my problem anymore. I don't have to worry about, does this technology exist or not? I can arbitrarily make alliances exist. Like I have all these constraints that no longer exist that allow me to re-envision what can happen. And to me, that's the biggest draw of a science fiction design, is the ability to do things that otherwise would not be feasible. It would just be too world-breaking in people's mind that you would not be allowed to do them.
Yeah. Right. And the flip side of that coin is anytime you're setting a piece of art or media in a different time than the present, you have to remember that you're also commenting about something about the present, because if you didn't, then nobody in the present would actually care or play that game either. So not only are you lifting constraints, but you're also giving people of today like these other what ifs along the way, like, oh yeah, that we want something to be relevant, but you can't do it in this time. It's like, okay, but we can do it there.
And it literally bridges the gap between now and whatever your science fiction world is, because you're using a weapon from now, and everybody's seen how weapons from now can last 30, 40 years, be pulled out of a warehouse 50 years later and refurbished. So it's totally plausible. And if there's that plausibility buy-in, just to wrap it all the way back to the beginning, yeah, it's going to work. It's just a beautiful way of doing it. It's just take the same thing and say, well, what if this, M16 is your primary weapon against these guys who are dropping from spaceships?
And with all that, I think we're gonna pull the plug on tonight. We don't want to overtax our guests or the audience or my ability to edit all this together. So, look, it's been a long time since we've gone 5 wide on the podcast, and I appreciate you guys all indulging me here and pitching in and chiming in. I think we've been able to cover a lot of interesting perspectives here, and I appreciate your guys' thoughts on all of those. So thank you for that. Audience, after this one, we've only got 3 episodes left in season 16, and then we're going to be rumbling into summer convention season, where you're going to start to see a lot more. First of all, we got all the live stuff that's going to be coming from Connections Online, but you're going to start seeing more stuff ramp up from both some of the other conventions we'll be attending, like Circle DC up in Washington, D.C., but also Origins, and then a couple other things over the summer. But you're also going to see probably a couple of experimental things with the crew on YouTube this summer, where we're going to, try out a couple of different show ideas and see what works and what sticks and what doesn't drive us crazy. 'Cause that's an important performance constraint right there. We got to not make ourselves nuts as a part of doing all this. But we'll see where we get from there. Meanwhile, I do want to draw some attention back for those of you that are listening to the podcast through whatever podcast platform where you've subscribed to us. I do want to draw your attention back to the main part of the site. If you haven't hit the main Dragoon site lately, man, you're missing a ton of great stuff. A couple of the dudes here on the call tonight are amongst the key contributors writing stuff for us. But man, we've maintained some ridiculous velocity this year. I hope I'm knocking on wood to hope I'm not jinxing us. But the stable of writers we've been able to assemble at this point has turned out to be really magnificent this year, and they have really stepped up their game in terms of both the quality of output and the quantity of output that they've been able to spit out for the site so far this year. It's been a joy to sit here and be able to read all of. I mean, first of all, I have to read all the stuff, right? Because I'm the guy doing all the posting and the editing. But even if I wasn't, I'd want to just sit here and read all the stuff because they're doing such a great job of spitting out all that content, whether it's reviews or the AARs that they're telling as stories, or some of the analysis pieces that they're doing and some of the historical writing we've got. It's really been great to see, and I hope you guys will start hitting the site and checking it out. And I don't know that you guys have seen this. We actually made a list over on gamingtrend.com. They put out a list of 5 tabletop gaming sites you should be reading, and we were one of the 5 that they noted in there. It was us, Tabletop Bellhop, Board Game Wire, Dan Thoreau's Space Biff, and there's another one that I'm totally blanking on. But yeah, we were one of the 5 that they threw out there, and so I thought that was really kind of cool, neat to be able to make that list. So, audience, thank you very much for being here and listening to the podcast, but also thank you, in advance for going and checking out all the great stuff these guys are doing on the website, and some cool stuff to be reading there. We're going to stop the recording, and I'm going to hope to, man, I'm hoping to the great digits on high that I remembered to turn off the outro music from the video the other night. Otherwise, it's about to get really funkier. So we're going to see and make sure we don't have our live video outro going as a part of this. In the meantime, we thank you for being here. We'll catch you next time on another episode of Mention in Dispatches.